Welcome to this lecture on Orchids, Oddities and Obsession. My name is Sandy Primrose, and you might be surprised with a name like Sandy to see a male in front of you. Well, you certainly will if you're American, but as you can tell from my accent, I'm Scottish, and in Scotland, Sandy is a male name, so hopefully we've cleared that one up. So let's move into the lecture, Orchids, Oddities and Obsession. And I think you'll learn some things today that you'll be quite surprised by. This title slide shows a very attractive orchid. It's one known as Vanda Miss Joaquim, also known as the Singapore orchid, and it was selected as Singapore's national flower in 1981 because its vibrant colours, its hardiness and its resilience reflect Singapore's qualities. It might surprise you to know that the orchid family is the largest and most diverse of the flowering plant families. There are over 800 genera and 25,000 species, more than twice the number of bird species in the world. And in terms of distribution, orchids appear everywhere. You'll find them in the Arctic Circle, you'll find them on the very tip of South America, you'll find them very close to Antarctica. But the greatest diversity of orchids occurs in the three places shown in red on the map. So that's the northern part of South America, it's the Southeast Asia, and in Madagascar, where there are over 1,000 species alone. Now, you might wonder, what is an orchid? You know it's a flower, but how would you recognize one? Well, if we start with some basic botany, flowering plants fall into two types. Those that when the seedling pushes through the ground have two leaves, and they are known as dicotyledons. And you get others which when they push through the ground have just a single leaf, and they are known as monocotyledons. And orchids are monocotyledons. And some of the characteristics of monocotyledons, first of all, the leaves have parallel veins. And secondly, when you look at the flower, it's got 6 tepals, 3 petals at the front and 3 sepals at the back. So orchids are monocotyledons, so they have parallel veins on their leaves, and they will have 6 flowering parts. If we then look a little bit at the reproductive structure, there you see on the right a typical orchid. One of the things that can happen is that the bottom petal can be greatly modified. Sometimes it's very large and is known as a labellum, and that allows insects who are going to pollinate it to land on it. Sometimes it's much more complex and contains nectar, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. When we look at the reproductive organs, they're quite different. Both the male and the female parts are carried on a single structure called the column, and the anthers, which produce the pollen, they have got a very characteristic structure with all the pollen grains on a single pollen-bearing structure called a pollinia. So let's take a little look. There's the inside of an orchid, and if you look there with the labelling pollinia, you can see 2 sort of yellow balls. These are the pollinia that contain all the pollen grains. And just for comparison, that's what a typical flowering plant would look like. There's a lily, and you can see the stamens bearing all the pollen grains. But as I say, in orchids, you don't get individual pollen grains, you get pollinia. And this is to facilitate pollination. The pollinia have a structure called a caudicle, and at the bottom there is a viscodium, and that actually sticks to pollinating insects. And if you look on the right there, you can see there's an insect. It's flying into an orchid to get nectar, and when it does, it picks up the pollinia, which is shown there with the red arrow, and when it moves to the next plant, it will pollinate it. And the man who made the biggest discoveries in terms of orchid pollination is this man, Charles Darwin, best known for his book, The Origin of Species, but he wrote this treatise on orchids in 1862. And what he was pointing out is that orchids have a phenomenal diversity of structures of their flowers, all with a single aim of facilitating pollination. And one of the very interesting things that Darwin did was he stuck a pencil into the flower of an orchid, and you can see on the left there that the pencil picked up the pollinia. It got stuck to it by the viscidium. But the other interesting thing is, within about a minute, the pollinia had bent over so that it was positioned better for pollinating the next flower that the pollinator would visit. And I've shown you on the right there what happens if you stick a pencil into an orchid flower, just as Darwin did. Now, one of the things that fascinated Darwin was the structures of orchids and how they had evolved in order to facilitate pollination. And he noticed that when an insect visits an orchid, it does so in order to get nectar. And the plant really doesn't want to give up nectar unless it really has to, because that's an energy loss. And so it tries to make the nectary as far away from the flower as possible, so that the insect will pollinate it but not take the nectar. Meanwhile, the insect wants the nectar and doesn't care about pollination, so you get this kind of battle of evolution between the plant and the insect. And the most interesting one is this plant, which is known as Darwin's orchid, because the nectary is about 12 inches from the front of the flower. And Darwin predicted there must be an insect whose proboscis would be up to 1 foot long. And the biologists at the time thought Darwin was mad, absolutely mad. They said, not possible for an insect to have a proboscis that is up to 1 foot long. And this is what Darwin thought would happen. An insect would come along and stick its proboscis 1 foot long so that it would reach the bottom of the nectary and it could feed on the nectar. Well, Darwin was proven right many years after his death. Such an insect was found. It's Morgan's sphinx moth, and it's named Xanthopan morgani predicta. Morgani after Morgan, who discovered it, and predicti because it had been predicted by Darwin. And what happens is the proboscis actually is normally curled up, and when it comes to visit this flower, it unfurls the proboscis and puts it into the orchid. It's rather like air refueling of a plane being refueled by an air tanker, and you get the hose that joins the two. It looks something like it. And if you look closely, you can see in the process of picking up the nectar, that moth has got pollinia attached to it. Other plants have different structures. This is a pink lady slipper orchid, and you can see on the right there, the bottom petal is very modified to form a kind of basket, and insects go into that to get the nectar. The only way they can get out is to come out the top, as shown in the diagram on the left, and in the process they pick up the pollinia. Perhaps the most interesting of the orchid pollination mechanisms is this one. This is known as the hammer orchid. Not a very attractive looking flower, but you'll see why it gets its name in a moment. It has a hinge on it, and normally the insect will land on the red part, which is attracted to. It thinks that is a female insect, lands on it, and if you look closely at the next slide, you can see what happens. That's why it gets the name the hammer orchid. It's the only time when a male gets a headache. Other forms of mimicry with pollination, these are bee orchids, and bees think that the orchid, the male bees think they are female bees and fly down to pollinate them, and in the process will pick up the pollinia. These orchids here, known as brassia orchids, they look like spiders, and parasitic wasps try to lay their eggs inside them, and and in the process will pollinate them. Now this is another very unusual orchid. This one was discovered in 1928 in Western Australia when a man called Jack Trott, he noticed a crack in the ground in his allotment, wondered what it was, bent down to look and got this most beautiful smell. So very gently pulled away the soil and he found this flower underneath. And it turns out this is an orchid and it grows underground. It has no leaves at all. And in order to get food, it gets food from neighbouring plants. And this is what it looks like when you clear it away. You can see the tuber is almost a foot away from the flower, which is buried in the ground. And as I say, in order to get nutrients, because it has no leaves, it sends out mycorrhiza, which interact with nearby broom plants, and it gets all its food from the broom plant, not from photosynthesis. In Europe, we have another orchid which is quite unusual. This one is known as the British ghost orchid, has no leaves, hence the specific name Aphylla, and its food is manufactured by fungi growing on the roots. And the flowers only emerge from the ground when these conditions are right. Usually that means very wet summers. And it's also best when you get very cold winters as well. And the great thing about this orchid, and it's given the name the ghost orchid, is because you might see it in some woods, say this year, and you'll never ever see it in these woods ever again. And then maybe in 5 years' time, this will pop up somewhere else in the country and then disappear again. Hence the name the ghost orchid. But it has quite attractive flowers. Now another oddity of the orchid world is this one, Grammatophyllum speciosum, which comes from Southeast Asia, as shown in brown on that map. And this is the largest orchid in the world. It grows to almost 1 ton in height, in weight, and a mature plant can have up to 10,000 flowers. And more than one orchid hunter has been killed when he has discharged or dislodged one of these from the branch of a tree. But it will also grow on the ground, and as you can see, it's a pretty big orchid. Now, contrast that with the smallest orchids in the world. There's one of them. And to give you an idea of its size, there's another one. And you can just make out there the sort of pink blob is somebody's thumb. And here's another example. And you can see from the person's hand, these are very, very tiny orchids. One of these flowers could be put on the head of a pin. So we've gone from very large bulbophyllum, which can weigh up to 1 ton, to these tiny specimens. And then let's come to this, the last of the oddities I want to talk about. This is one that was discovered by scientists from Kew Gardens. It was found in Madagascar in 2020, and it has to be the ugliest orchid in the world. Unless you were a very keen botanist, I think you would struggle to even recognize it as an orchid. So I've told you about the oddities. Let me move on now and talk a little bit about the origin of the name. And the name comes from Greek mythology. Orcus was the son of a nymph, and during a big feast for Bacchus, Orcus reverted to an alien state and he tried to rape a princess. The fates were incensed and they intervened, and to make the punishment fit the crime, they threw Orcus to the animals who tore him apart. Justice having been done, the gods then metamorphosed his body parts into plants, and in the case of his testicles, they became tubers, and these tubers grew to give you the orchid plants. So that's the origin of the name. And now that you know the origin of the name, they're supposedly derived from testicles, you can understand why in the Middle Ages the herbalists believed that orchids were good for fertility and as aphrodisiacs. This is from the English herbalist Parkinson. If a man ate a large orchid tuber, he would begat many children. And one Greek test claimed that if you took an orchid, it would allow you to perform 70 consecutive acts of sexual intercourse, which I do think is slightly excessive. Another English herbalist, Culpeper, he said the roots are to be used with discretion. They are hot and moist in operation under the dominance of Venus and provoke lust exceedingly. So another claim to be an aphrodisiac. If we move to modern day South Africa, tribesmen will crush the roots of Eulophia and rub them on their penis to get an erection. And in India, recently, Indian scientists have isolated a compound from this orchid, Vanda tessellata, and found that it has properties very similar to Viagra. Moving back to South Africa, the traditional healers warn you of the leopard orchid because it says the flower is very beautiful, but it is the Canaan roots that carry the power. If you want to attract the one you love, you must chew them at midnight, then spit them out while saying the name of your love. Moving to colder climes and Iceland, there Orchis maculata was used as an aphrodisiac, but now, believe it or not, they put the orchid tuber on pizza and call it Pizzayagra. Other uses for orchids are manifold. Here's just a few of them. In Honduras, children make trumpets from the hollow stalks of this orchid, Schomburgkia. In Guyana, nearby, the pulverized pseudobulbs, which are just swollen stems, they're used as adhesives by shoemakers. In Malaysia, the split pseudobulbs of this orchid, Coelogine, are used as blackboard erasers. And in Sumatra, they also use them to cure sick elephants. And lastly, in Turkey, they make ice cream from Orchis species. And talking of ice cream, it may surprise you to know that the vanilla flavouring, which is used in the making of vanilla ice cream and many other products, comes from an orchid. Vanilla is the largest product to be made from any orchid species, and it's done mostly in the Indian Ocean islands of Reunion and nearby islands, Madagascar, but it does happen to a certain extent in Tahiti and also to a lesser extent in the Caribbean. And to the right there, I have shown you an article. It's a recipe. It was done by Thomas Jefferson. It's in his own handwriting, and it's his recipe for ice cream, and it was found recently in the Library of Congress. And then, while sticking on the subject of food, chikanda is a meatless sausage, shown there on the right, and it's made from orchids collected by orphans in Tanzania. And the biggest problem is so many orchids have been collected that they're in danger of becoming extinct. So moving away from uses of orchids, and I want to tell you a little about the orchid in art and literature. And we shall start with that well-known writer, William Shakespeare. This is just one quotation. There with fantastic garlands did she come, of crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples, that liberal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. Talking about long purples, these are the orchids. The only problem is we're not sure whether Shakespeare was writing about Orchis mascula or about Dactylorhiza maculata. Both of them will grow wild in the UK and certainly in England. And why do they give them a grosser name? Well, I've already told you that the tubers look like testicles. And why dead men's fingers? Well, that's what they can look like when they're dug up. This here is a reproduction of the 7th of the unicorn tapestries. These were embroidered in the 16th century for Anne of Brittany. The series illustrates the various phases of a hunt for a unicorn, and it's an allegory on marriage and fertility. Only a virgin had the power to capture the unicorn. And in this particular tapestry, the unicorn has been captured. It's within a circular enclosure, which represents the family. And growing amongst all the flowers there, I can't point it out, there's too many flowers, are some orchids, Orchis mascula, and that's the symbol of fertility. Now, some of the famous writers were absolutely appalled by orchids. Marcel Proust equated them with harlots and homosexuals, but they did feature prominently in his novels. George Bernard Shaw compared them to courtesans. And John Ruskin, the great socialist, he found them overtly sensual and bizarre, and he tried to get the names changed. Without success, I might add. But now I want to start and tell you a bit about obsession. And this is a quote from the owner of a well-known orchid nursery. When a man falls in love with orchids, he'll do anything to possess the one he wants. And I stress here, it is man. Women do not get the obsession with orchids that men do. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. And the start of the obsession came in 1818, and it was caused by this orchid shown here. In 1818, there was a collector known as William Swainson. He was collecting plants in Brazil for the Glasgow Botanical Garden, and he sent a collection of plants back to Glasgow, but he also sent them to an English botanist, William Catley, who lived just north of London. And in amongst the packing material, Catley noticed a bulb, and he nurtured it in his greenhouse, and soon it developed into this orchid plant I've shown you here. And a few years later, Glasgow Botanic Gardens, they got this orchid flowering as well, and it was given the name Cattleya labiata, Cattleya after William Catley. Unfortunately, the plants that Catley had and the ones in Glasgow died not long afterwards, and they disappeared altogether. There was no other specimens anywhere in Europe. So collectors went out looking for them and mistakenly thought that Swainson had collected them near Rio de Janeiro. And they hunted high and low around Rio de Janeiro without success. Had they read any of Catley's writings or Swainson's, they would have discovered that he wrote in one of the Edinburgh Botanical Journals that he collected them in Pernambuco province, which is much further north in Brazil. But eventually, a French collector, he found them quite by chance, growing it in Pernambuco province, and brought them back into cultivation. Now this man here is another key figure in the orchid mania, the 6th Duke of Devonshire, William Cavendish. He's best known because he was given a present of some bananas that he cultivated. These are the bananas that most of us eat today and are known today as the Cavendish bananas. He was a keen grower of plants, not interested in orchids until he was given a gift of one, the one shown there, Oncidium papillo, and he was absolutely smitten. Now the only problem was, of course, these orchids come from tropical regions, so you had to have the right conditions for growing them. So what he did was he hired somebody to look after his plant collection, and the man he took on was a man called Joseph Paxton. And Paxton, after he was hired, he turned up at Chatsworth, where the Duke was living, at 4:30 in the morning. He climbed over the wall to get in, he explored the grounds, he set the men to work, and by 6 o'clock he was breakfasting with the cook and falling in love with her charming niece, whom he soon married, I might add. He recognised that to grow orchids you need to have the right conditions, and he came up with the ingenious idea of dividing the orchid house into 3 climatic zones: a cool zone, an intermediate zone, and a warm zone. And that way he could replicate the various growing habits for orchids. Now, the man who probably did more to popularise orchids is the man shown here on the left, Henry Frederick Conrad Sanders. He was German, so to give him his proper name, Heinrich Friedrich Sanders. He was born in Germany, and he started his working life in a German nursery. And in 1866, he arrived in England, and he began working for a seedsman, James Carter, who lived just to the south of London. Next door to the seedsman's place was a large house owned by a very wealthy man who had a very attractive daughter. And over the years, Sanders wooed the daughter and married her. And this proved very useful because she was a very wealthy lady, as we'll learn in a moment. He also met the man shown on the right, Benedict Rosal. He was a plant hunter, particularly an orchid hunter, and he'd been shipping plants to England, but he wanted someone to act as his agent, and that man was Sanders. And Sanders was so prolific in the finding and selling of orchids that he got nicknamed the Mighty Orchid King. Sanders of St Alban, the Mighty Orchid King, is filling all his boxes for shipment in the spring. Why did he become the Orchid King? Well, here we are, 1875. He's now importing orchids and communicating with the great orchid man, Professor Reichenbach in Germany. 1876, 10 years after he'd arrived in England, he buys an established seed business in St Albans, which is about 15 miles north of London. 1881, he moves to new premises of 4 acres. And by 1884, he's got over 3,000 feet of glass houses. 3,000 feet. 1886, he stops selling seeds. By 1891, 3 acres of glass houses. And soon he's handling 2 million orchids a year. So where did he get the money for this? As I mentioned a few moments ago, he married a wealthy lady, and she basically funded his business. Here I'm showing you just the sales record for one day in London at one of the sales warehouses. I won't try to read it, but there you can see there are loads and loads and loads of orchids, all selling for prices which, if you convert them into dollars at a straight 1-for-1, you can see they're worth a lot of money. This one orchid here, he sold this in 1904, one specimen, for £1,500. So that's about $1,600 or $1,700 at today's exchange rate. In today's money, that would be £160,000 or about $180,000. $180,000 for one specimen. Today, you can buy it for £15. I might add that Sanders orchids were sold 4 days a week in London, and he would sell up to 340 cases of orchids a day. At his peak, Sanders employed 23 men to scour the world for orchids, the so-called orchid hunters. And it wasn't a very healthy job. You can see here, Arnold, one of his hunters, disappeared up the Orinoco. Klaboch, who was Rosel's nephew, killed in Mexico. Other ones shot by natives in Brazil, a lot of them murdered. And then at the bottom, Bestwood, he disappeared in Madagascar. In actual fact, Brown, while hunting in Madagascar, came across Bestwood, and Bestwood was living with the daughter of a native chief, and he'd had to marry the daughter or be killed. Later on, Bestwood did manage to escape, but Brown himself was murdered. Another orchid hunter, Liam Humboldt, he had dinner with 6 other orchid hunters one year, and pretty soon all of the other hunters were dead. So not a healthy job. And you're going to hunt for orchids in all sorts of places, the jungles of South America and Southeast Asia. The hunters complained constantly to Sander about hardships. There's just some of them: plague, cholera, poor food, appalling accommodation, dreadful heat. And what was Sander's response? Send more plants and make sure they're packed properly. So he was a very generous employer. Michelot, who was one of his hunters, he witnessed a horrific fight between locals in Papua New Guinea. They were supposed to be helping him, but instead of helping him, most of them were left dead. Some were even beheaded. So he cleared out. To give you an example of some of the difficulties in being an orchid hunter and some of the obsession, Sanders sent William Arnold in 1880 to South America to collect this orchid here, Masdevallia tavarensis. He was travelling down from London to Southampton on the train, and he got talking to the man in the train compartment, who told him that he too was travelling to Venezuela. His name was White, and he said he was an agent for a Birmingham manufacturer. Arnold told White that he was an orchid hunter, and he exchanged stories, and he told White about what he was going to be doing. At Southampton, they both boarded the same ship for Venezuela, and all was well. Unfortunately, Sanders had got wind of this, and when the ship docked in Venezuela, Arnold received a telegram telling him that White was not a representative of Birmingham manufacturer. He also was an orchid hunter working for Sanders' big rival, Dr. Hugh Lowe. Sanders pulled White into his cabin, put a gun on the table and said, "Only one of us is going to get out of here alive." Fortunately, both of them did, but Sanders told Arnold, "Follow White wherever he goes, and if you get a chance, urinate in his orchids to kill them." Another interesting orchid, this one here, Vanda sandriana. Sanders had a collector named Robelin, and he was sent to the Philippines to collect as many new species of orchid as he could. And one day he was the guest of a chieftain in the southeast of Mindanao, and he was put up for the night in a tree house. During the night there was an earthquake, a very vicious earthquake. The ladder to the tree house was knocked away, so Robelin was stuck in the tree house. And when daylight came, he noticed that the roof had come off of the tree house, and up above him in the branches of the tree was this orchid, which he collected and brought it back to Sanders, who had it named after him. Charles Curtis was a collector for another of Sanders' rivals, the Veitch Nursery, and he brought back this particular Paphiopedilum species that got named after him, Paphiopedilum curtisi. And Curtis would not tell anybody where he found it, except to say he got it on the island of Sumatra. Once the initial shipment of these orchids had been sold, the price went up. So any collector selling to another would sell for vast sums of money. Sanders was intrigued, and 5 years later, he sent his collector Klaus Erichsen to Sumatra to try and find this orchid. Well, Erichsen searched high and low. He had escaped cannibals who had developed a taste for Europeans. And after several near misses, he was told to leave the island, but he got permission to stay for a few more days. Unfortunately, he got ill and he was resting in the local hospital. And then he noticed, scrawled on the message scrawled on the wall of the hospital, and it was basically a drawing of this orchid and the initials CC underneath. Erichsen assumed that CC was Charles Curtis, decided he was close by, and fortunately was able to collect 2,000 specimens. In 1857, another collector called Forbes was sent this unusual variety of Dendrobium, which he passed on to Kew. And eventually, Sanders went to Kew, worked out that it had come from New Guinea. And so in 1890, he sent his collector Michelitz to go and find this. While looking for the orchid, he passed a load of human sacrifices, which did make him a little nervous, to say the least. But eventually, he found the desired orchids, and the natives were quite happy for him to take large numbers of these orchids in return for some money. So soon, Michelitz has collected about 2,000 to 3,000 of these, got them on a ship, and he is very happy. And then came disaster. So he sends a telegram to Sander. The ship had caught fire, all the orchids destroyed. So ship burnt, what do, Michelitz? Sanders' response, return, recollect. Next telegram, too late, it's the rainy season. Return, Sander. No sympathy at all. So Michelitz goes back, but he's cleaned out all the orchids, so he has to go elsewhere, and eventually he finds some more of them. The only problem is that they are being watched over by a skull. This is an idol of the natives, and only by giving them lots of trinkets like handkerchiefs and magnifying glasses and so on was he able to get some. And he brought them back complete with the skull. And much later, Walter de Rothschild purchased the skull. And this is Sanders along with his wife. This is the house they stayed in St. Albans. And you can tell just how influential he was. The house, for example, was panelled with oak, and that oak was provided by the Duke of Marlborough. Such was the esteem in which he was held. Unfortunately for Sander, the price of orchids dropped significantly in Britain, and orchid fever died out. And there were probably 3 reasons for this. First of all, orchids were becoming readily available. So ready availability means lower prices. There was then the First World War. And also, at this time, plant hunters were bringing back many novel garden plants that weren't orchids and which were much easier to grow. And eventually, he opened a nursery in Bruges in Belgium to try and offset the loss of income in England. But then the First World War came and these glass houses in Bruges were destroyed. And gradually the business ran down and closed in 1956. And today, where his vast greenhouses were, is a school with its playing fields. But one story which is worth telling is this one. This man, Captain Neptune Blood, was in the Australian Army. He was in New Guinea during the Second World War. He was escaping from the Japanese, But he saw this particular orchid, recognized what it was, that it was an extremely rare orchid, decided to try and rescue it, which he did. He dug it up, and despite fleeing from the Japanese, he managed to get to safety and get the orchid re-established. So, end of the Second World War, 2018, orchid fever has pretty much died out in Britain, and to a lesser extent in Europe. But at that time, it now takes off in the US, and in 2018, you get the formation of the American Orchid Society. And orchid fever then hits Americans. This is just one. This is a fairly recent man, Lance Burke, lived in California. He got hooked in orchids. He started going to Mexico with a lot of orchids and used to bring them back, and he would smuggle them in. He had a gull-wing Mercedes, and he used to hide them in the wheel arches to get through customs. But he started traveling all over the world, having got absolutely hooked on them. Goes to Southeast Asia, and his experiences are unbelievable. He survived a plane crash. He had his notes stolen. He had his some of the plants he'd collected stolen. He discovered lost orchids. Other collectors stole them. He escaped from pirates. A really quite amazing tale. Another orchid man was John LaRoche. He ran a nursery for exotic plants in Florida, and people would come to him and pay him to take them into the nearby Fakahatchee Strand State Park just to see this one orchid, the rare ghost orchid. Now, this ghost orchid, of course, is quite different from the ghost orchid that I told you about earlier that we have in Britain. But this one only grows in the swamp, and he would take people in. And one day he was approached by the local Seminole tribe. They wanted him to create a nursery as part of a sort of self-help project for the tribe. So LaRoche studied Indian law, and he found a loophole in the state code which exempted Indians from laws protecting rare plants. So in 1993, he and some Seminoles went into the Fakahatchee State Park and emerged with 136 orchid plants. Immediately, all 4 men were arrested for illegally taking wild orchids. So LaRoche, he was convicted, and he had to pay a large fine, and he was banned from keeping plants for a long time. The Indians were much luckier because they were exempt under laws, Indian laws, and could plead immunity. The story was ultimately written up by Susan Orleans in the book called The Orchid Thief, and later this was turned into a film called Adaptation, where Nicolas Cage played John LaRoche, and there's a clip from the film, and I don't think in any way Nicolas Cage looks at all like John LaRoche, but that's films for you, who cares? Now, what had happened was that LaRoche had been arrested under what is known as CITES law. CITES, or the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Roughly 5,000 species of animals and 29,000 species of plants are protected under CITES legislation against over-exploitation through international trade. And the countries which have signed up to CITES are shown on this map in green. Now, CITES legislation makes a lot of sense for animals, such as whales, rhinoceros, elephants, because they might only produce one offspring every 2 or 3 years. Contrast that with orchid plants, where a single seed pod can produce 10,000 seeds, and there might be 25 pods in a single plant. So it's a little bit different. But nevertheless, CITES legislation forbids trade in animal parts and plant parts such as pollen, flowers, seed pods and leaves. The crazy thing is, you may have protected orchids in your locality. If then they're going to build a new road or a dam, these orchids will be destroyed. If you go and dig them up the day before they're going to be destroyed, you can be prosecuted under CITES legislation. It's a bit crazy. And one man who fell foul of this legislation is this man, Professor Guido Brehm, a German orchidologist. He's an expert in orchids. He's written 6 books on them and a world authority in certain species. And one day he went to Denmark to see some orchids that were in a collection there, and he was given permission by the owner to take them back to Germany. Now these were 100-year-old dried orchid specimens. So these had been collected long before CITES legislation. Nevertheless, when he came to German customs, he was arrested for bringing protected plants in under CITES legislation. And he was so incensed, he did what some of us would like to do. He punched the customs officer in the face. So he did get arrested for assault. He pleaded in mitigation what he'd done, saying it just didn't make sense, and he was let off with paying a fine to charity. Nevertheless, every time he wanted to see these orchids, he had to make a trip back to Denmark. But one case in America, which really caused a big stir because of its breach of CITES legislation, embraced this particular botanic garden in Florida. You can see it, the Selby Botanic Gardens. And the story starts with a man called Michael Kovacs, and he was desperate to have an orchid named after him. And what he did was he found an orchid hunter and said, look, I want an orchid named after me, will you help me? And so an agreement was struck, and Kovacs and his colleague went off to Peru. And one day while driving along the road, he came across a stand selling orchids, quite a common thing in parts of Peru. And he saw this particular orchid with the biggest flowers anyone had ever seen. Kovacs was delighted, and he took these back to the Selby Botanic Gardens. Now, why did he go to Selby Botanic Gardens? Well, before a name becomes official, the orchid has to be described in a known botanical journal. So Selby had their own botanical journal, and they could publish the description very quickly. And so the orchid people at Selby agreed to this, and the orchid was given the name Phragmipedium kovacii, and Kovacs was delighted. Unfortunately, a former employee of Selby, Eric Christensen, he knew of this orchid, and he had planned to call it Phragmipedium peruvianum as a salute to Peru. He was really so angry that he contacted the Peruvians, and he also contacted the US Fish and Wildlife Services. And 2 months after Kovacs had taken this orchid to Selby, his greenhouse in Virginia was raided by federal agents. He also went through the records at Selby, and a federal grand jury in Tampa subpoenaed a dozen Selby employees and board members. And it turns out Selby Gardens had not checked the paperwork that Kovacs claimed to have had. The outcome, Meg Lohman, who was the Selby director in Louisville and knew nothing about it, she lost her job. Wesley Higgins, the lead orchid expert, was fined $2,000 and got 2 years probation. The gardens were fined $5,000, but spent millions in lawyers' fees and even more in lost donations. Kovacs himself got a $1,000 fine and 2 years probation. The one, I think, who got the roughest treatment was George Norris. He was only an orchid trader in Texas. His home was raided by 45 armed federal agents because of orchids. Amazing. Paperwork not in order, went to prison at 67 years of age, suffering from poor eyesight and diabetes. And the specimens that Kovacs had brought back, they were sent back to Peru and were soon sold by a local orchid nursery. Now, another example of orchid obsession was written up by this man, Hansen, Eric Hansen. He was an explorer. He would write for the New York Times. He once spent 6 months walking across Borneo. When he got to the other side, he decided to walk back again, and he wrote about it. And he was approached not long afterwards by 2 US orchid growers. They'd heard about his knowledge of Borneo, and they paid him $25,000 each for him to take them on a trip to Borneo just to see growing in the wild, not to collect, just to see growing in the wild, Paphiopedilum sanderianum. The trip was very successful, but the local Pedan people who were acting as guides, they were absolutely flabbergasted. Why would you pay $25,000, which was more than they would ever earn in a lifetime, just to see this orchid, which you can't eat and which has no medicinal properties? Nevertheless, Hansen wrote it up in this book, Orchid Fever. Another collector of orchids who had a rough time was this man. It's Tom Hartdyke. He had travelled all around Australia, Southeast Asia, collecting orchids. And then he decided he wanted to go to Central America because he was sure there would be unusual orchids there. He met up with a man called Paul Winder, and in 2000 they set off from Texas to cross the Darien Gap, which lies between Panama and Colombia. Unfortunately, just before they got to Colombia, they were captured by FARC guerrillas, and they were held captive for 9 months, held to ransom, but the parents refused to pay the ransom, and on several occasions they thought they would be killed. Nevertheless, Hartdyke continued to collect orchids, had a little orchid garden, and he wrote about his experiences in this book, The Cloud Garden. But there was some surreal moments. On one occasion, Hartdyke and Winder decided to play a game of cricket. The guerrillas would refuse to join in, and at one point they were using a lime fruit as a ball. Hartdyke bowled it to Winder. He hit it with a stick. The fruit shattered and absolutely covered the face of the commandant. They were sure they were going to be executed for that. On another occasion, they were woken up during the night by one of the female guards who came into their tent, and she demanded that Winder's Daffy Duck boxer shorts should be handed over, even though they were much too small for her. Quite surreal. And to give you an example of the obsession, this orchid here, Paphiopedilum rothschildianum, is also known as the gold of Kinabalu, and it sells for today $5,000 a stem. It was first discovered in 1987, growing in Mount Kinabalu in Borneo, growing between 500 and 1200 meters in altitude. It can take 15 years to flower, so we have no idea how many exist in the wild, but within days of its discovery, orchid enthusiasts had been in there and stripped every single bloom. This orchid was discovered by an Asian orchid expert. He found it in Sarawak, and before he could even describe it in the literature, it was being sold on the black market. And as this Dr. Richard Thomas says, to a dedicated collector of wild source orchids, price has no bearing. And this is a copy of an article from the Straits Times, and basically it says, black market trade in wild orchids. In Malaysia in particular, you can go to market stalls and you will find orchids that are protected under CITES regulations. And the authorities, although they've signed up to CITES, do very little about it. And so to finish, at some exotic orchids, I hope you like these or this, and thank you for your time.